Another week came and went, during which I spent a great deal of my time about the pit mouth. I had come to the conclusion that the arched hole was where the swine things had made their exit from some unholy place in the bowels of the world. I was tremendously curious to know where the hole led, though so far the idea had not struck me of making an investigation. I was far too much imbued with a sense of horror of the creatures to risk contact with them. But as the days slid by, my fear of the swine things became an emotion of the past, more an incredible memory than aught else. Thus, a day came when I procured a rope from the house, and having made it fast to a tree on the pit edge, let the other end drop down into the cleft. Then I climbed slowly down until I reached the hole. I stood and peered in. All was dark, and not a sound came to me. Yet a moment later, it seemed I could hear something. I held my breath and listened. But all was silent as the grave, and I breathed freely once more, and then I heard the sound again. It was like the noise of laboured breathing. As I stood there, petrified, my foot dislodged a pebble, which fell into the dark with a hollow chink. At once the noise was taken up and repeated a score of times, each succeeding echo being fainter. Then, as the silence fell again, I heard that stealthy breathing. But now I no longer feared. I knew that the strange sounds were not made by any lurking swine creatures, but were simply the echo of my own respirations. But I had received such a fright that I was far too shaken to think of entering that dark hole then, and so I returned to the house. By the following day, the water in the pit had risen even more. I realized that unless I carried out my investigation soon, the opening would be submerged. And so a day later saw me standing at the top of the cleft, fully equipped for the task. I had brought, in addition to the rope, a bundle of candles and my shotgun. As before, I fastened the rope to the tree. Then, having tied my gun across my shoulders, I lowered myself over the edge of the pit. At this movement, Pepper, who had been eyeing my actions, barked in warning. But I was resolved on my enterprise, and bade him lie down. Reaching the entrance, I let go the rope and untied my shotgun. Then, with a last look at the sky, which I noticed was clouding over rapidly, I went forward into the passage and lit one of the candles. Holding it above my head, I began to move on slowly, throwing my glances in all directions. The path trended downwards and to the left in the direction of the house. Very cautiously, I progressed forward, stopping every few steps to listen. I had gone perhaps 100 yards when, suddenly, it seemed to me that I heard a faint sound behind me. With my heart thudding heavily, I listened. I could hear it distinctly now, the soft padding of running feet. I backed against the rocky wall and, holding the candle above my head, waited, gun in hand. Seconds later, 2 eyes reflected back from the gloom the rays of my candle. I raised my gun and aimed. Even as I did so, something leapt out of the darkness with a blustering bark of joy that woke the echoes like thunder. It was Pepper. He was dripping wet. I concluded that he must have tried to follow me and fallen into the water. But I was curiously glad to have the old fellow with me. He was company, and somehow I felt less afraid. For some minutes we proceeded slowly along, the path still leading straight towards the house. But then I stopped and held the light high, and reason enough I had to be thankful that I did so, for there, not 3 paces forward, the path vanished into a hollow blackness. Very cautiously I peered down, but could see nothing. I crossed to the left of the passage. Here, against the wall, was a narrow track, some 3 feet wide, that led onward. Carefully, I followed it. On one side, the solid, unyielding rock, and on the other, a yawning chasm. Gradually, I noticed that the path trended steadily to the right, and I discovered that I was not going forward, but simply circling the huge abyss. I had evidently come to the end of the passage. 5 minutes later, I stood on the spot from which I had started, having been completely round what I now guessed to be a vast pit. I picked up a rock and hurled it into the chasm. Then I stepped forward and listened, but though I kept perfectly quiet for at least a full minute, no sound came back to me from the dark. I knew then the depth of the hole must be immense. I lit several more candles, and putting them on the edge, I tried to get some dim sight of the place. But they were totally insufficient for my purpose. And then Pepper gave a sudden howl that was taken up by the echoes and repeated with ghastly variations, dying away slowly. At the same moment, I seemed to hear a noise like a diabolical chuckle rise up from the depths below. I started. Then I recollected that it was probably the echo of Pepper's howl. Pepper moved away from me, nosing along the rocky floor. I went towards him, holding the candle low, and as I moved, I heard my boots go sop, sop. From somewhere along the passage, a stream of water was running in the direction of the great opening. And then I heard a murmurous roar that grew louder and filled the whole cavern with a deafening sound. I had sprung to one side, and turning, saw a great wall of foam sweep past me and leap tumultuously into the waiting chasm. After the first rush, the flow of water eased, but a short examination showed me that the water reached right across the passage and was running at a tremendous rate. It was evident that I must make my exit as hurriedly as possible. The noise of the water was deafening, but with a call to Pepper, I stepped out into the flood, using the gun as a staff. Instantly, the water boiled up over my knees. It was all I could do to keep my legs. Pepper managed a great deal better than I did, going ahead of me like a guide and helping me to break the force of the water. On we went, struggling and gasping, until about 100 yards had been safely traversed. Then, suddenly, I slipped. Instantly, the water leapt over me in a cataract, hurling me down towards that bottomless hole. I was helpless, gasping and drowning. But all at once something gripped my coat. It was Pepper. Missing me, he must have raced back to find me, and then caught and held me until I was able to get to my feet. I have a dim recollection of having seen momentarily the gleams of lights, but of this I have never been quite sure. Of course, the lights could have been the distant flames of the candles I have left burning, but as I have said, I am by no means sure. My eyes were full of water, and I had been badly shaken. There was I, without my gun, without light, with the water deepening, depending solely upon old Pepper to help me out of that hellish place. My faithful Pepper led me, dragged me, upward and onward, until at last I saw a gleam of blessed light. It was the entrance. Only a few yards further, and I reached the opening, with the water surging hungrily around my loins. And now I understood the cause of the catastrophe. It was raining heavily, literally in torrents. This had caused the premature rise in the level of the lake. Luckily, the rope by which I had descended was streaming into the opening. Seizing the end, I knotted it around Pepper's body, then, summoning up the last of my strength, I climbed up the side of the cliff. I reached the edge in the last stage of exhaustion. Yet I had to make one more effort and haul Pepper to safety. I have but a very hazy remembrance of the end. I recall pulling through moments that lagged strangely. I have also some recollection of seeing Pepper's muzzle appearing over the pit edge. Then all grew suddenly black. I suppose I must have swooned, for the next thing I remember, I opened my eyes and all was dusk. I was lying on my back, and Pepper was licking my ears. Eventually, I managed to stand up and make my way back towards the house. How I reached there, I scarcely know, and of the days that followed I remember still less. When I recovered my senses, it was to find that I had been in bed for 2 weeks. Yet another passed before I was strong enough to totter out into the gardens. It was a couple of days later that I managed to get to the pit. There I found that in my week's absence there had been wrought a wondrous change. Instead of a 3-parts-filled ravine, I looked out upon a great lake, whose placid surface reflected the light coldly. The water had risen to within a few feet of the pit edge. Only in one part was the lake disturbed, and that was the area above the entrance to the vast underground pit. Here there was a continuous bubbling. As I stood there, it came to me how wonderfully things had worked out. The entrance to the place whence the swine creatures had come was sealed up by a power that made me feel there was nothing more to fear from them. Back in the house, I thought to pay a visit to the great vault where the trapdoor is situated. Reaching the place, I approached slowly. There it was, with the stones piled upon it, just as I had last seen it. I had the lantern with me, and it seemed that now would be a good time to investigate whatever lay under the great oak slab. Placing the lantern on the floor, I tumbled the stones off the trap and pulled the door open. As I did so, the cellar became filled with the sound of a murmurous thunder that rose from far below. A moist wind and spray drove into my eyes, blurring my vision. I felt into my pockets for a piece of twine with which to lower the lantern into the opening. Even as I fumbled, the lantern slipped from my fingers and hurtled down into the darkness. For a brief instant, I watched its fall and saw the light shine on a tumult of white foam, some 100 feet below me. Then it was gone. I now knew the cause of the wet and noise. The great cellar was connected with the pit by means of the trap, which opened right above it. And I had an explanation for that chuckle that sounded the first time I'd opened the trap. Evidently, some of the swine things had been right beneath me. Another thought struck me. Were all the creatures drowned? Would they drown? Had they life as we understand it? Or were they ghouls? I closed the trapdoor. Then I piled the stones back upon it and made my way upstairs. After this time, I had serious thoughts of leaving this house, and might have done so but for the wonderful thing that happened. How well I was advised in my heart when I stayed on here, in spite of those visions and sights of unexplainable things. For had I not stayed, then I would not have seen again the face of her that I loved and lost. I would write down the story of those sweet old days, but it would be like the tearing of old wounds. But now she has come to me, out of the unknown. Strangely, she warned me about this house, begged me to leave it, but admitted when I questioned her that she could not have come to me had I been elsewhere. Yet still she warned me, earnestly, telling me that it was a place long ago given to evil. It was thus that I came to the place of the Sea of Sleep, so she termed it. I had stayed up in my study, reading, and must have dozed over the book. Suddenly, I awoke with a start. For a moment I looked round with the puzzled sense of something unusual. There was a misty look about the room. The flames of the candle shone through it palely at first, but gradually it increased, and soon I could see nothing. I cannot tell how long a space thus passed, but after a while I became aware that I was standing on the shore of an immense and silent sea. Overhead, the sky was of a uniform grey colour, the whole place being lit by a stupendous globe of pale fire that swam above the horizon. Beyond the gentle murmur of the sea, an intense stillness prevailed. Then, as I stood there, it seemed that a bubble of white foam floated up out of the depths, and then, even now, I know not how it was, I was looking upon the face of her, and she looked back at me with such a commingling of joy and sadness that I ran towards her blindly, crying strangely to her, in a very agony of remembrance, of terror, and of hope, to come to me. Yet in spite of my crying, she stayed out there upon the sea, and only shook her head sorrowfully. But in her eyes was the old earth-light of tenderness that I had come to know before all things ere we were parted. I grew desperate, and essayed to wade out to her, yet though I would, I could not. Some invisible barrier held me back. "Oh, my darling, I cried. And at that she came over swiftly and touched me, and it was as though heaven had opened. Yet when I reached out my hands to her, she put me from her tenderly with stern hands, and I was abashed. Through tears, the noise of eternity in my ears, we parted. She whom I love. Oh, my God! I was a great time dazed, and then I was alone in the blackness of the night. I knew that I had journeyed back once more to the known universe. And now I come to the strangest of all the strange happenings that have befallen me in this house of mysteries. It was night, about 11 o'clock. Pepper and I kept one another company in the study. I was reading, curiously enough, the Bible. I have begun in these later days to take a growing interest in that great book. Suddenly, a distinct tremor shook the house, and there came a distant, whirring buzz. I looked across at Pepper. He was sleeping peacefully. Gradually, the whirring noise decreased, and there came a long silence. All at once, a glow lit up the end window. I walked across the room and pulled aside the blind. As I did so, I saw the sun rise from behind the horizon. It rose with a steady, perceptible movement. I could see it travel upwards. Up it went. It was broad daylight now. Behind me, I was conscious of a sharp, mosquito-like buzzing. I glanced around at the clock. Even as I looked, the hour hand moved quickly from space to space. I had a dumb sense of astonishment. I saw now that the sun had risen high into the heavens and was still visibly moving. As the window came into shadow, I saw another extraordinary thing. The fine weather clouds were floating across the sky. They were scampering, as though 100 miles an hour wind blew. To the west, I saw the sun drop with an incredible smooth, swift motion. Quickly, the room began to darken. The sun disappeared from my sight, almost with a jerk. The evening seemed to merge into an almost instant night. About this time, the buzzing in the corner ceased, telling me that the clock had run down. No more than a few heartbeats, and the sun rose swiftly, and there seemed to come a strange acceleration. It made one clean, clear sweep through the sky and disappeared behind the western horizon, and night came and went, like haste. Faster and faster spun the world, and now each day and night was completed within the space of but a few seconds, and still the speed increased. Once I turned from the window and glanced at Pepper. In the flash of a day, I saw that he slept quietly. Presently, feeling lonely and distraught, I called to him, but he took no notice. I called again. Still he moved not. I walked over to where he lay and touched him with my foot to rouse him. At the action, gentle though it was, he crumbled into a mouldering heap of bones and dust. For a minute I stood, stunned. Then, as I stirred the heap with my foot, it occurred to me that this could only happen in a great space of time, years and years. I tried to understand what it meant, but I could not think coherently. I glanced around the room, and now for the first time noticed how dusty and old the place looked. Dust and dirt everywhere, piled in little heaps in the corners, and spread out upon the furniture. Quickly, but with steps that I noticed for the first time, tottered, I went across the room to the great pier glass and looked in. It too was covered with grime, and with trembling hands I began to rub off the dirt. Presently I could see myself. Instead of the great, hale man who scarcely looked 50, I was looking at a bent, decrepit figure whose shoulders stooped and whose face was wrinkled with the years of a century. I turned away. How tired I felt. I wondered about my sister. Was she dead as well as Pepper? All had happened so quickly and suddenly. This must be indeed the beginning of the end of all things. It occurred to me to go and look for her, but I felt too weary. I moved slowly to the window. Quickly, and ever quicker, ran the flicker of day and night, and suddenly it seemed I was aware that the flicker had died out, and instead there reigned a comparatively steady light, which was shed upon all the world, from an eternal river of flame that swung up and down, north and south, in stupendous, mighty swings. Time fled, and the weariness that was mine grew insupportable. I turned from the window and saw my old chair. The thought of sitting in it brought a faint sense of comfort to my bewildered wretchedness. I sat down and closed my eyes. Once or twice, as though coming through thick mists, I heard noises, faintly. Then I must have slept. I awoke with a start. For a moment I wondered where I was. Then memory came to me. But I felt refreshed, and the weariness had left me. Suddenly it struck me, with a sort of grotesque seriousness, that I was still alive. I thought of Pepper, and wondered how it was that I had not followed his fate. I was alive, hundreds and thousands of centuries after my rightful period of years. I glanced around the room. It seemed different, strangely, utterly different. Then I knew what made it appear so strange. It was bare. There was not a piece of furniture in the room. I realized that this was but the inevitable end of the process of decay. Thousands of years. Over the floor was spread a deep layer of dust that reached halfway up to the window seat. It had grown immeasurably while I slept, and represented the dust of untold ages. My gaze rested thoughtfully upon where once had stood my chair, and there in its place I made out a long undulation rounded with heavy dust. I knew, and shivered at the knowledge, that it was a human body, ages dead, lying there beneath the place where I had slept. The body, under that shroud of dust, was my own dead shell. I did not attempt to prove it. I knew it now, and wondered why I had not known it all along. I was a bodiless thing. A while I stood, trying to adjust my thoughts to this new problem. In time, how many thousands of years I know not, I attained some degree of quietude. I grew gradually more collected, while the world slipped across the centuries into the future. It might have been 1,000,000 years later that I perceived, beyond possibility of doubt, that the fiery sheet that lit the world was indeed darkening. Another vast space went by, and the whole enormous flame had sunk to a deeper copper color. The sun was dying. Of that there could be little doubt. And still the earth whirled onward through space and all the eons. At this time I remembered wondering how much longer the house would stand. Also, I queried to myself whether I should be doomed to stay bodiless upon the earth forever. An indefinite period passed, and it seemed that the arc of fire became less sharply defined. Presently, as I watched, the smooth outward flow ceased, and I was able to perceive that there came a momentary but irregular darkening of the world. This grew, until once more night descended in short but periodic intervals upon the wearying earth. Longer and longer became the nights, and the days equaled them. Gradually, days and nights lengthened out until they equaled a space somewhat less than one of the old earth hours. About this time, I found myself able once more to see the gardens, for the world had now grown very still and changeless. Yet there were no gardens, nothing that I knew or recognized. In place thereof I looked out upon a vast plain stretching away into the distance, and always there reigned an incredible death silence and desolation, the immutable, awful quiet of a dying world. Silently, years moved on, and there grew up within my mind a great and overwhelming distress of uneasiness. I felt that I must fight against it, and, hoping to distract my thoughts, I looked up towards the north, in search of the nebulous whiteness which still I believed to be the far and misty glowing of the universe we had left. Even as I raised my eyes, I was thrilled with a feeling of wonder, for the hazy light had dissolved into a single great star of vivid green. Slowly but surely the star grew upon my vision. With increased size, its color became more impressive, reminding me of a huge emerald, scintillating rays of fire across the void. Years fled away in silence, and the green star grew into a great splash of flame in the sky. An instant it seemed, and the sun had vanished. Then the earth moved into the black shadow of the sun, and all was night, black, starless, and intolerable. Filled with tumultuous thoughts, I watched across the night, waiting. Years it may have been, and then in the dark house behind me, the clotted stillness of the world was broken. I seemed to hear a soft padding of many feet. A faint, inarticulate whisper of sound grew on my sense. I looked around into the blackness and saw a multitude of eyes. As I stared, they appeared to come towards me. For an instant I stood, unable to move. Then a hideous swine noise rose up into the night, and at that I leapt from the window. I have a confused notion of having run a while, and after that I just waited. Waited. Several times I heard shrieks, but always as though from a distance. Time moved onward. I was conscious of little save a sensation of cold and hopelessness and fear. An age, it seemed, and there came a glow that told of the coming light. It grew tardily. Then the first ray from the green star struck over the edge of the dark sun and lit the world. It fell upon a great ruined structure some 200 yards away. It was the house. Staring, I saw a fearsome sight. Over its walls crawled a legion of unholy things, almost covering the old building. They were the swine creatures. Years appeared to pass slowly. The earth had almost reached the center of the sun's disk. The light from the green sun, as it must now be called, gave the old house the appearance of being wrapped in green flames. The swine creatures still crawled about the walls. Suddenly, there was a loud roar of swine voices, and up from the center of the roofless house shot a vast column of blood-red flame. I saw the towers flash with fire, a blazing furnace of red and green. Fascinated, I watched, until an overwhelming sense of coming danger drew my attention. I glanced up, and at once it was borne upon me that the sun was closer. So close, in fact, that it seemed to overhang the world. Then, I know not how, I was caught up into strange heights, floating like a bubble in the awful effulgence. Far below me, I saw the earth, with the burning house in a mountain of flame. Round about it, the ground appeared to be glowing, as though the world was becoming ignited from that one plague spot of fire. The swine things appeared quite unharmed. Then the ground seemed to cave in suddenly, and the house, with its load of foul creatures, disappeared into the depths of the earth, sending up a strange blood-colored cloud. In a while I looked around. The huge bulk of the sun rose high above me. Suddenly the earth appeared to shoot forward towards the sun. I heard no sound, but out from the sun's face gushed a tongue of dazzling flame. It seemed to leap almost to the green sun, shearing through the emerald light, a very cataract of blinding fire. It reached its limit and sank, and on the sun glowed a vast splash of burning white, the grave of the earth.